The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt, sinking into the grit that passed for a main street. "White Ridge," the driver called out, his voice hoarse with dust. Eleanor Whitcomb gathered her valise, her knuckles white. She stepped down onto the splintered boardwalk, and the dust immediately coated her black boots. White Ridge, Colorado, 1883. It sounded like a promise of clean edges, of a fresh start. But the town itself was broken. It was a scar in a valley, gouged out by men hunting for gold and silver, and now left to fester. Buildings leaned against each other for support, their false fronts peeling. At the far end of the street, on the edge of the wilderness, a forgotten chapel stood skeletal against the bruised evening sky. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter. She was Miss Whitcomb, the new schoolteacher, a woman of suitable, if plain, breeding, educated, quiet. It was all a lie. She carried her past like a stone in her gut. Boston was 2,000 miles behind her, but the shame was as close as her own skin. The memory of a man's empty promises, of a doctor's cold hands, of the gray, rainy afternoon when she had bled out her future in a rented room. Her family had not disowned her with shouts. They had done it with a silence that was far louder, packing her off with a small sum and a letter of recommendation secured through a distant, obligated relative. Now she was here, where no one knew her name, or the ruin attached to it. Her boarding room, run by a nervous, bird-like widow named Mrs. Gable, was clean, but smelled of boiled cabbage and lye soap. It was a cage, but it was a safe one. The town itself was not safe. It was rigid. Morality in White Ridge was a club used to beat down anyone who stepped out of line. The church was new, loud, and run by Reverend Halford, a man whose sermons were heavy on fire and damnation. His greatest weapon, however, was the Women's Temperance League. Eleanor met their leader, Mrs. Agatha Plum. On her second day, Mrs. Plum's face was a tight knot of gray wool, her eyes missing no detail. They sat in the one-room schoolhouse, the air smelling of mice, old chalk, and the pine cleanser Mrs. Plum herself had provided. "We are a God-fearing community, Miss Whitcomb," Mrs. Plum stated. It was not a welcome. It was a warning. "We expect our children to be instructed in arithmetic, scripture, and moral fortitude. We do not hold with modern notions." Eleanor clasped her hands in her lap. "I am here to teach reading and sums, Mrs. Plum. The children's souls I leave to you and the Reverend." Mrs. Plum's thin lips tightened. She had noted the lack of a Bible in Eleanor's valise and the way Eleanor looked men in the eye when she spoke. "See that you do. Your predecessor was found wanting. Too much poetry." Eleanor learned quickly that poetry was White Ridge code for any emotion that was not fear or gratitude. She was too opinionated. Her walking skirt, though modest, was cut for walking, not for shuffling. She was too bold. She was a threat. And then she saw him. He was the town's other secret, the one they did not hide, but displayed as a warning. His name was Eli Foster. From the schoolhouse window, she watched him. He worked in the graveyard behind the old, abandoned chapel. He was the town's gravedigger. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, and wore canvas trousers worn pale with use. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, the swing of his pickaxe a steady rhythm against the hard earth. The town treated him like a leper. He was the untouchable. "That one," Mrs. Gable whispered to her one evening, wringing her hands as she watched Eli walk down the far side of the street. "He is a dark soul, Miss Whitcomb, a convicted man." Eleanor paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Convicted of what?" "Mrs. Gable's eyes darted to the window. "A terrible thing. Back in Kansas. Assault on a young woman. A rancher's daughter." She lowered her voice. "He served time in prison. When he got out, no decent town would have him. He drifted here. He never speaks of it. He never speaks at all. If he can help it, he just digs." Eleanor watched him. He did not look like a monster. He looked battered. He looked like a man who had been left out in the weather too long. There was a stoicism in his posture that she recognized. It was the armor of the exiled. She felt a pull, a strange, unwelcome kinship with the man who worked among the dead. He was marked by his past, just as she was. The only difference was his scars were visible. Hers were hidden beneath her high-necked blouses and quiet demeanor. The warning, when it came, was direct. "Miss Whitcomb, Mrs." Plum said, stopping her outside the general store. "A word." Eleanor inclined her head. "You have been seen looking toward the chapel yard. It is not proper for a lady to cast her eyes on such a man. He is base, an animal. You are the moral guide for our children. You will do well to remember that. Stay away from him. He is poison." The hypocrisy burned in Eleanor's throat. These women, who spoke of grace, were the first to cast the stone. The warning, meant to repel her, only solidified her curiosity. She, too, knew what it was to be called poison. The encounter that sealed it happened a week later. School had just let out. The children scattered with shouts, their noise echoing in the thin air. Eleanor was cleaning the chalkboards when she heard a sharp yelp, followed by a low, pained whining. She stepped outside. Near the woodpile, a stray dog, a brown mongrel she had seen nosing through trash heaps, was lying on its side. Its back leg was bent at a sickening angle. It looked as if one of the freight wagons had clipped it. Eleanor knelt, her heart aching. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered. She reached out a hand, and the dog snapped weakly, its eyes white with terror and pain. She heard no footsteps, but a shadow fell over her. She looked up. It was Eli Foster. He stood over her, his presence immense. He smelled of hard soap and pine and the cold, mineral scent of the earth. His face was unreadable, carved with lines of sun and sorrow. He did not speak to her. He did not even acknowledge her beyond a single, hard glance. He knelt. The dog whimpered, tucking its head. "Easy, boy." Eli's voice was a low rumble, like rocks moving underwater. It was the first time she had heard him speak. His hands, which she had only ever seen gripping a shovel, were scarred and calloused. The knuckles split, but the way he touched the animal, it was a revelation. He was impossibly gentle. His large, rough fingers moved over the broken limb with a tenderness that made Eleanor's throat tighten. The dog, sensing the calm in his touch, went still. Eli looked at the leg, his expression grim. He looked back at Eleanor. "It's a bad break." "Can you will it?" she stammered. He tore a long strip from the hem of his own worn shirt. He was not sentimental. He was practical. He found 2 flat pieces of discarded kindling from the woodpile, and with a swift, sure movement, he set the bone. The dog cried out once, a sharp sound that was quickly muffled as Eli bound the leg, his movements economical and precise. He finished his work, and then, without a word, he scooped the wounded animal into his arms. He held the dog against his chest, cradling it. He stood and looked at her. His eyes were gray, deep-set, and held no warmth. They held only knowing, a shared understanding of pain. He did not smile. He did not offer comfort. He just held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then he turned and walked away, back toward the shadows of the chapel yard, the dog secure in his arms. Eleanor stood there, her hands dusty with chalk, and watched him go. The town was wrong about him. A man with hands like that was not an animal. He was just broken. The storm came 2 nights later. The air had been thick all day, a heavy, bruised yellow. Eleanor kept the children late, trying to finish a lesson on long division as the pressure built outside. By the time she dismissed them, the sky was a churning mass of purple and black. She hurried to clean up, her nerves on edge. The quiet of the empty room was worse than the noise of the children. The first crack of thunder split the sky, rattling the windows in their frames. She grabbed her shawl and locked the schoolhouse door. The wind hit her instantly, a solid wall that stole her breath and tore at her hairpins. Rain followed, not in drops, but in a solid, horizontal sheet. Her boarding house was 3 blocks away. She would be drowned before she got to the end of the street. The closest shelter was the old chapel. She ran, head down, holding her skirts. The main street was already a river of mud. Lightning struck the ridge above the town, and the thunder was immediate, a deafening explosion that made her cry out. She half fell, half climbed the low stone wall of the graveyard. The chapel door was surely locked. She ran for the porch, but then she saw it, a flicker of yellow light from behind the building. A lantern. She stumbled around the side, into the deep shadows, under a small, sagging lean-to where the gravedigger kept his tools. Eli Foster was standing. He was soaked, his hat dripping, his back to the storm as he worked on a broken shovel handle. He heard her approach and spun, his hand dropping to the hatchet on his belt. "Mr. Foster!" she shouted over the wind. He stared, his face grim in the lantern light. He looked less surprised than burdened. He stepped aside, a silent invitation into the small, dry space. She ducked under the lean-to, pressing herself against the cold stone wall of the chapel. The space was tiny, barely big enough for 2. It smelled of damp earth, wet wool, and pine resin. The storm raged around them, a furious, primal noise. They stood inches apart, not looking at each other. The lantern on the workbench cast wild shadows. She was trembling, from cold, from fear. She looked at his hands, now gripping the workbench. They were muddy, trembling too. "A terrible night," she said, her voice high and thin. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the rain. "The earth is soft, at least." A gravedigger's observation. It was so stark, so honest, it cut through her fear. She looked at him, really looked at him. He was not a monster. He was just a man who was cold and alone and trapped in a storm with the town's school teacher. "They warned me about you," she said suddenly, the words defiant, torn from her. He finally turned his head. The lantern light carved deep hollows under his eyes. His gaze was heavy. "They warned me about you too, ma'am." His honesty was a shock. "Me? You ask too many questions. You read too many books. You walk too fast." He said it simply, as fact. It was an admission. They were the same, the outcasts, the poison. A massive crack of lightning struck the chapel's rotted steeple. The sound was a physical blow. Eleanor cried out and instinctively lurched forward, her hands flying up to brace herself against his chest. She felt the solid, wet wool of his shirt. Beneath it, the heat of him, the hard muscle. He did not move. He just stood there, a rock in the chaos, letting her cling to him. The thunder rolled away. The world went quiet, save for the drumming rain. She was still pressed against him. She should move. She should apologize. She was Miss Whitcomb, the proper school teacher. But she was also Eleanor, the woman who had bled alone in Boston, the woman who was so tired of being cold, of being good, of being a lie. She looked up. His face was inches from hers. She could see the faint, white line of a scar on his jaw. He was not looking at her with lust. He was looking at her with a profound, exhausted sorrow. She rose on her toes. She pressed her cold, wet mouth to his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, foolish thing. It was all the loneliness and defiance she had stored for a year. It tasted of rain and mud. He stiffened, a shock running through him. Then, for one searing second, he kissed her back, a reflex of pure, starved hunger. His arms clamped around her, pulling her so tight she could not breathe. Then, just as quickly, the shame hit him. He shoved her away, not violently, but firmly, pushing her back against the stone wall. He turned, bracing his hands on the workbench, his back to her. His shoulders heaved. "Ma'am," he choked out. "No, you shouldn't. You do not know what I am." "I saw you," she whispered, her voice ragged. "With the dog." "That's not—" He shook his head. "I am what they say. I am marked. You get near me, you get marked, too." He sounded ashamed, broken, like he believed the town's verdict. That shame, his shame, broke something in her. She would not let him be this for her. She would not let the misses, plums of the world, win. She stepped forward, placing her muddy hand flat on the back of his wet shirt. She felt the tremor run through him. "I am already marked, Eli," she said, using his name for the first time. He turned slowly. The raw need in his eyes was a mirror of her own. She touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw. "Don't stop!" she gasped, the words a prayer against the storm. "Not tonight." He stared at her for one terrible second. All the fight, all the shame, drained out of him, replaced by something heavier, a surrender. He did not kiss her. He took her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her from the lantern light. He dragged her deeper into the shadows, behind a stack of old, unused pine boxes, pressing her back against the cold, damp wood of the chapel itself. It was not love. It was a collision. It was breathless and desperate, a fumbling of wet clothes and cold hands and muddy boots. His mouth was rough, demanding. Her back scraped against the rough planks. She clung to him, digging her nails into his shoulders, anchoring herself. It was the undoing of two lives, a shared rebellion against the world that had branded them both. It was two wounded souls clinging to each other in the dark, afraid of being seen, but more afraid of being alone. When it was over, they did not speak. The storm had moved on, leaving only the steady, heavy drum of rain on the tin roof. They stood in the shadows, their breathing harsh in the sudden quiet. He pulled his canvas coat from a peg and, his movement stiff, wrapped it around her. It was heavy, and it smelled of him. He pulled her against his side, his arm a solid bar around her waist. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, expecting the cold bite of regret. She waited for the familiar chill of shame to settle in her bones. But as she stood there, trembling in the arms of the town gravedigger, hidden by the shadows of the forgotten church, Eleanor Whitcomb felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely and utterly warm. Neither of them regretted it. The sun rose in a clean, sharp line, cutting the gray from the sky. The air was cold, scoured clean by the storm. Eleanor had not slept. After the rain had eased to a steady drip, they had separated, moving back to their respective corners of the lean-to. They had huddled in Eli's coat, not speaking, just listening to the night. It was a shared vigil. The desperation had passed, leaving a quiet, aching tenderness in its place. Before the first hint of light, he had touched her shoulder. "You must go," he'd whispered. Her body was sore. Her mind was unnervingly clear. She looked at him in the pre-dawn gloom, seeing the exhaustion in his face. She had done this. She had brought the storm to him. "Eli," she started, but he shook his head. "Go, before they wake." Her boots were soaked, the leather stiff and caked with mud. Her stockings were ruined. To put them on would be a cold, slow misery. She shoved her stockings into her reticule and picked up the boots, holding them in one hand. She pulled his coat tighter. "Your coat?" "Keep it. You are freezing." He was already turning away, gathering his tools, his movements stiff. He was already rebuilding the wall around himself. She stepped out from the shelter. The graveyard was a sea of mud. The air smelled of wet pine and turned earth. She walked, her bare feet sinking into the cold, wet grass between the headstones. She did not look back. She reached the low stone wall just as the church bell tolled 6 o'clock. Across the street, a door opened. It was Mrs. Halford, the Reverend's wife. She was carrying a small basket, likely on some errand of early morning charity or judgment. Eleanor froze. Mrs. Halford stopped dead. Her gaze, sharp as broken glass, took in everything in one swift motion. Miss Whitcomb, the schoolteacher, her hair undone, wild around her face, her dress stained with mud at the hem, her feet bare and filthy, and the coat she was wearing, the rough, unmistakable canvas coat of the gravedigger. Eleanor saw the woman's mouth tighten, a flicker of something almost like pleasure in her eyes, the pleasure of a prophecy fulfilled. Mrs. Halford did not speak. She did not have to. She simply turned, her back rigid, and walked back into her house. The trial had begun. Eleanor walked the rest of the way to Mrs. Gable's boarding house, the mud sucking at her feet. She let herself in the back door. Into the kitchen, Mrs. Gable was there, stoking the stove. She looked up, and her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "Miss Whitcomb, dear heavens, you are, what happened?" Eleanor dropped the muddy boots by the door. "I was caught in the storm. Mrs. Gable, I took shelter." In the chapel?" the woman whispered, her gaze dropping to the canvas coat. "Yes." Eleanor unbuttoned it, her fingers clumsy and cold. She handed the coat to the widow. "Please, could you see this is returned to Mr. Foster?" Mrs. Gable took the coat as if it were a live snake, holding it away from her body. "Oh, my dear. Oh, my dear." The gossip spread faster than the fire it would eventually become. By the time Eleanor arrived at the schoolhouse, her hair combed, her face scrubbed, and wearing her driest, sternest black skirt, the air had already changed. The children were quiet. They did not rush to greet her. They sat at their desks, their eyes averted. When she walked past the general store, the men on the boardwalk stopped talking. When Mrs. Plum swept past, she did not nod. She gathered her skirts as if to avoid touching a patch of filth. She felt the old, familiar chill, the isolation, the silent, suffocating judgment of the righteous. It was Boston all over again, but this time it was not followed by grief. It was followed by a slow, burning anger. She kept the children late, drilling them on their multiplication tables until her voice was raw. She would not be cowed. When the last student, a nervous boy named Thomas, had run from the schoolhouse, she sat at her desk, the silence pressing in. A shadow fell across the floor. Eli stood in the doorway. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the empty desks, the maps on the wall. "They are poisoning them against you," he said. His voice was flat. "It is not your concern," she replied, her own voice sharp. He stepped inside. He was holding his coat. Mrs. Gable had evidently found a way to return it. "It is. This is my doing. It was my choice. Eli." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were full of a pain so deep it startled her. "You do not know what you have chosen. You think this is just whispers." He took a step closer. "These people, they do not just whisper. They destroy. I am used to being hated. I am the town leper. It is my penance. But you are their hope, and they will crucify you for falling." "Penance?" she said, standing. "Penance for what? A crime you did not commit?" His face hardened. "You know nothing about it." "Then tell me." "Stay away from me, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "This is your only warning. They saw you leave my yard. They know you spent the night. Go to the Reverend. Weep. Tell them I forced you. Tell them I bewitched you. Say anything, but do not stand by me." He was offering her an escape, the same one that had damned him. "No," she said. You are a fool." "I will not lie," she said, her voice trembling. "I will not be a victim for their satisfaction. I have done that before. I will not do it again." He stared at her, his hands clenching and unclenching. "Then you are a bigger fool than I thought. They will take everything from you." "They have nothing I am not willing to lose," she said. He turned and left, the coat still draped over his arm. She watched him walk back to the graveyard. He was right. It was a choice, and she had made it. She would not pretend it did not happen. That evening, after a silent, agonizing supper where Mrs. Gable refused to meet her eye, Eleanor left the boarding house. She did not try to hide. She walked down the main street, past the saloon, past the staring eyes, and turned toward the chapel yard. He was there, working by the light of 2 lanterns. He was digging a new grave. The sound of the shovel hitting the rocky soil was the only sound in the twilight. He heard her approach and did not stop digging. The hole grew deeper. "I told you to stay away," he said, his voice muffled by the earth. "I am not good at taking orders." She sat on the low stone wall, a few yards away. He stopped, resting his forearms on the shovel handle. He was sweating, despite the cold. "Why are you here? Do you want to be seen?" "I do not care if I am seen," she said. "I came to ask you about Kansas." He flinched, as if she had struck him. He threw the shovel from the hole and climbed out. He walked to the lean-to and picked up a canteen, drinking deeply. "There is nothing to tell," he said, wiping his mouth. "They said you assaulted a woman, a rancher's daughter. They said you served time for it." He was silent. He looked up at the stars, which were beginning to pierce the deep purple sky. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear. "She was not just a rancher's daughter. She was a rich man's wife. Barely 19, he was 40. He picked up a stone, turning it over and over in his calloused hands. "I was a hand on her husband's ranch. I knew to stay clear of the main house. But she was not like them. She was burning up from the inside. Loneliness. He treated her like a prized horse, something to show, then lock in the barn." Eleanor watched his face. He was not in White Ridge anymore. He was back in the heat of Kansas. "She sought me out, in the stables, by the river. She just wanted to talk. About books, about Boston, where she had gone to school. And then she did not just want to talk." He threw the stone. It hit a marker with a sharp clack. "We were seen, not in the act, but close enough, by her husband's foreman. She was terrified. Her husband, he was a powerful man, a cruel one. He locked her in her room. When he finally let her speak, it was in front of the sheriff. He told her what to say." "She lied?" Eleanor whispered. "She said I took her by force," Eli said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She was young, and she was terrified. He would have ruined her, so she ruined me instead. It was an easy choice for them. His word against mine, her tears against my silence. I served 4 years in prison." "And when you got out?" "I drifted west. I could not stay there. I heard they had moved west, too. Her husband bought a new claim, somewhere in Colorado, trying to escape the scandal, I suppose." He walked over to a small, unassuming grave in the oldest part of the yard. It was set apart from the others. He nudged a clump of weeds away from the base with his boot. "I came to White Ridge 2 years ago. Took this job. No one else wanted it. 3 months in, I was digging a grave for a miner. And I saw this one. I saw her name." Eleanor stood and walked over. She read the simple wooden marker. Sarah, beloved, no last name, no dates. "It is her," Eli said. "I came to this town by chance, and she was already here, in my yard." "How did she?" "The town record says consumption, but I am the gravedigger. I know what they say, and I know what is true. I spoke to the woman who prepared her body. She drank a bottle of laudanum. She could not live with the lie. or with him. He touched the top of the wooden cross. So I dig my penance. Here, I stay here because it feels like I am standing watch, making up for not being strong enough to save her, or myself. The silence that followed was heavy. Eleanor thought of her own past, the one she had buried so deep. His mark was visible. Hers was not. She was not the only one left alone, Eleanor said, her voice shaking. He turned, his face unreadable in the dark. Boston, she said. I was promised to a man, from a good family. We were to be married in the spring. She could not look at him. She looked at Sarah's grave. He was charming, and I was foolish. I thought it did not matter, as we were to be wed. But I became pregnant. She said the word. It hung in the cold air, a shocking, terrible sound. I told him I was so happy. I thought he would be, too. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. He left. His family sent him to Europe, on a grand tour. They said I had trapped him, that it was my female weakness that had caused the problem. She wrapped her arms around herself. I lost the child, alone, in my room. I was very ill. My family, they told everyone I had a nervous fever, but they knew. My mother, she would not look at me. When I was well enough to travel, they gave me money, a letter of recommendation, and the name of this town. They disowned me with silence. They buried me just as surely as you buried Sarah. The only difference is, I am still walking. Eli did not move for a long time. The lantern light threw shadows across his face. He stepped toward her. He did not touch her. He just stood in front of her, a solid, unmovable presence. We are a pair, then, Miss Whitcomb, he said, his voice rough. The whore and the monster. The town is right to be afraid of us. No, she said, looking up, meeting his gaze. We are the survivors. He raised one hand, slowly, as if it pained him. He did not touch her face. He touched her hair, his rough fingers just brushing the strands above her ear. It was a gesture of such profound, broken tenderness that it made her want to weep. They will not let us be, he said. Then let them try, she answered. Their secret meetings continued, but they were no longer desperate. They were necessary. They were not just for the passion, though that was there, a sharp, aching relief in the cold. But it was more. It was survival. They met where they could not be seen, down by the frozen river bend, hidden in a thicket of bare willows, their breath pluming in the air. He would bring her a roasted potato, still hot from a small fire, and she would read to him from her book of poems. He listened with an intensity that humbled her. They met in an abandoned barn north of town, the loft thick with the dust of old hay. They would lie in the straw, his arm under her head, and talk. They talked about the past. They talked about the land. They talked, tentatively, of a future, a place in somewhere else where their names were not ruined. Their intimacy deepened. It was in the way he would rub her cold hands between his. It was in the way she would instinctively lean against his shoulder. It was a defiant tenderness, a small, warm fire built against the coming blizzard. But the town was closing in. It began with the children. First, Mrs. Plum arrived at the schoolhouse to formally withdraw her nieces. We cannot have their tender souls in the care of a fallen woman, she said, her face a mask of righteous pity. Then the Johnson boys were pulled. Then the Davies girl. Within a week, her classroom of 12 students had shrunk to 4. Eleanor did not back down. She taught the remaining 4 with a fierce dedication. Then came the other warnings. She left her boarding room one morning to find a dead rabbit on the doorstep. Its throat slit, Mrs. Gable shrieked and ran inside. Eleanor, her stomach churning, fetched the coal shovel. She carried the small body to the edge of the woods and buried it. A few days later, it was a cluster of dead crows, strung up on her door handle. She continued to walk to the schoolhouse, her head high, her gaze fixed forward. She felt the eyes on her back. She heard the whispers as she passed. Harlot, Jezebel. She refused to break. The town elders decided to strike at the root. They approached Eli in the graveyard. It was late afternoon, the sun already weak. Reverend Halford led the group. Mr. Plum was with him, as was the town sheriff, a quiet man named Brody, who looked as if he would rather be anywhere else. "Foster," Reverend Halford said. His voice was the one he used for damnation. Eli stopped digging. He leaned on his shovel, waiting. "Your presence in this town has long been a trial to us," the Reverend declared. "We have tolerated your affliction, but you have now spread your contagion. You have corrupted the one person, besides myself, charged with the moral education of our youth." "The school teacher," Mr. Plum clarified, spitting tobacco juice onto the ground near Eli's feet. "You have soiled her." Eli's grip on the shovel tightened. He looked past them, at Sheriff Brody, who was studying his boot tips. "She is a free woman, Reverend," Eli said, his voice calm. "She is a lost soul," Halford thundered. "And you are the serpent who tempted her. This filth will not stand. This town will be clean." "What do you want?" Eli asked. "We want you gone," Mr. Plum said. "Be out of White Ridge by sunrise tomorrow. If you are still here, there will be consequences." "Consequences?" Eli asked, his voice still quiet. Reverend Halford smiled, a thin, cold expression. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Mr. Foster, sometimes he speaks with a quiet word, and sometimes he speaks with fire." Sheriff Brody looked up, his face troubled. "Reverend, that is enough." "It is never enough, Sheriff, when battling sin," Halford said. He turned back to Eli. "By sunrise, or you will reap the whirlwind." They left him. Eli stood for a long time, watching them go. He looked at the grave he was digging. He looked at the small, lonely shack he had built near the trees. That night, Eleanor was afraid. She had not seen Eli since the morning. She paced her small room, the floorboards creaking. Mrs. Gable had left her supper outside her door, a cold plate of beans, as if she were a prisoner. She looked out her window, toward the dark shape of the chapel. She was waiting for a lantern. She was waiting for a sign. Around midnight, she saw it. It was not a lantern. It was a flicker of orange against the dark trees, then a bloom of red. "No," she whispered. She grabbed her shawl and ran from the room, ignoring Mrs. Gable's startled cry. She ran down the empty street, the mud frozen in hard ruts. When she reached the chapel yard, she stopped. Eli's shack was a roaring inferno. The heat was so intense it scorched her face from yards away. The dry pine wood popped and cracked, sending showers of sparks into the dark sky. "Eli!" she screamed, panic ripping her throat. "Eli!" She ran toward the lean-to. It was empty. His tools were scattered, as if in a struggle. A few townsfolk were gathering, drawn by the light. They kept their distance, their faces illuminated by the flames. She saw Mrs. Plum, her arms crossed, her expression grimly satisfied. She saw Reverend Halford, his hands clasped as if in prayer. Eleanor ran around the back of the burning structure, her eyes streaming from the smoke. "Eli!" He was not there. The roof caved in, sending a column of fire straight into the sky. He was missing. He was gone. Eleanor stood in the flickering, terrible light, the cold seeping into her bones. They had done it. They had warned him, and then they had brought the fire. She did not know if he had fled, or if he was taken. She turned and faced the silent crowd. She locked eyes with Reverend Halford. She was not grieving. She was not afraid. The woman who had bled alone in Boston was gone. The woman who had been shamed into exile was dead. The woman standing in the ashes of Eli's home was filled with a rage as hot and bright as the fire itself. The smoke was a black fist in the cold night air. The crowd stood silent, watching the last of Eli's life turn to ash. Eleanor Whitcomb stood apart from them, the heat drying the tears on her face before they could fall. The fire burned, but a different cold, a different rage, was settling in her heart. They thought this was an ending. They thought they had driven him out, or worse. Reverend Halford was already turning away, his duty done, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. Eleanor refused to believe it. She had seen his tools scattered near the lean-to. She had seen the deep, dragged tracks in the mud, heading not toward the road, but toward the dark line of the wilderness. He would not have left without her. He would not have left without a fight. She ignored the whispers. She ignored the smug, righteous faces of the Temperance League. She turned her back on the burning shack, on the town of White Ridge, and walked past the last headstone. She stepped into the darkness of the forest. She had no light. She had only the fury in her chest and the desperate, unshakable belief that he was still out there. The moon was a sliver, offering nothing. She moved by memory, by feel, following the small game trail that led up the ridge. "Eli!" she called, her voice a raw whisper. The wind stole the word. She stumbled over roots, her skirt tearing on the sharp edges of scrub oak. Her hands were raw. She was a schoolteacher, a woman of letters and quiet rooms, and she was hunting for a man in the black wilderness like a wolf. The thought did not scare her. It focused her. She searched for an hour, then 2. The cold was a physical weight, pressing against her. She was about to cry out again when she heard it. It was not a call. It was a low sound, half human, half animal, a sound of pure pain. It came from a cluster of boulders near the creek bed. She scrambled down the slick bank, her feet sliding in the mud. Tucked behind a great slab of granite was a shallow opening, a cave no bigger than a root cellar. "Eli?" She knelt at the entrance. He was inside, slumped against the rock wall. He was alive. She crawled in, the smell of damp earth and blood filling her nose. He was dazed, his head bleeding from a long gash above his temple. He was clutching his left hand to his chest. "Eleanor," he breathed. It was not a question. It was a statement of disbelief. "They did this," she said. It was not a question either. "Halford and Plum," he whispered, his voice thick. "They were waiting. They wanted to talk. I knew it was a lie." She reached for his injured hand. He tried to pull it back, a hiss of pain escaping him. She saw it in the faint moonlight. The back of his hand was a ruin of blistered, blackened skin. "They held it," he choked out, his body shuddering. In the stove, before they lit the shack. They held it, to make me pray for forgiveness." A cold so profound it stopped her breath filled Eleanor's chest. This was not just a warning. It was an inquisition. "We have to move," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the panic she should have felt. "You cannot stay here. They will come back to look for a body, or to finish." "I cannot." "You will." She slid her shoulder under his good arm. "Where, Eli? Where can we go? There must be somewhere." He was dazed, his thoughts slow. The old line shack, north by the ridge. The one I told you about. The one the miners left." She nodded. She remembered. He had pointed it out once on a walk, a shadow in the distant pines. "We go there." Getting him to his feet was an agony. He was a heavy man, and half his body was resisting. She took his weight, her own small frame screaming in protest. They stumbled out of the cave. The journey was a blur of darkness and pain. Every step was a new calculation. He leaned on her, and she navigated the forest by instinct. She did not know the woman she had become, this creature of the night, half dragging a wounded man through the woods. She had abandoned her post. She had abandoned her name. She had abandoned everything but the man beside her. As they cleared the first ridge, the air changed. It grew colder, sharper. A single white flake drifted down. It landed on Eli's dark hair. Then another and another. The snow began to fall. It took them the rest of the night. By the time the first gray light of dawn broke, they were ghosts in a white world. The miner's cabin was just a dark square in the swirling snow, half buried in a drift. The door was not locked. It sagged on one hinge. Inside, it was a single room, thick with the smell of pine rot, pack rats, and old iron. There was a rusted stove, a broken cot, and a three-legged table. It was a palace. Eleanor lowered Eli onto the cot, which groaned under his weight. The snow was falling faster now, a thick, silent curtain. It was burying their tracks. It was burying White Ridge. It was burying their past. For 3 days, the storm raged. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. Eleanor, fueled by a clarity she had never known, became a different person. She tore strips from her petticoat and, using the last of the whiskey from a flask Eli had in his pocket, she cleaned his wounds. The gash on his head was deep. The hand was worse. She found a jar of old axle grease in a corner, thick with lard, and she smeared it over the burn. A crude, desperate poultice. She wrapped the hand tightly. He drifted in and out of a fevered sleep. In his delirium, he spoke of Kansas, of Sarah, of a rancher's boot on his neck. Eleanor did not sleep. She sat by the cot, watching the snow pile up against the single, cracked window. She found a half-empty box of matches and, with wood splintered from the broken table, she started a fire in the stove. The smoke was thin, but the warmth was life. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Eli woke, his eyes clear. He stared at the low ceiling. "Eleanor." "I am here." She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, a book in her lap. "You stayed." "I stayed." The snow had stopped. The silence outside was absolute. A heavy, white blanket on the world. They were isolated, trapped, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor felt safe. Their relationship, born in the shadows of the graveyard, strengthened in the silence of the snow. The desperation of their first encounter was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet intimacy. There was little food, a handful of dried beans she found in a tin, which she boiled for hours into a thin, tasteless soup. Eli's good hand was his right, his left, the burned one. He kept swaddled in rags. He could not hunt. He could not trap. "You will have to learn," he said, his voice quiet. He had a rifle. He had managed to grab it from the shack before they dragged him out, stashing it in the cave. It was an old, heavy Winchester. He took her outside. The snow crushed hard under her boots. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. "Hold it tight," he instructed. "Against your shoulder. No, tighter. Let it be part of you, or it will break you." She was terrified of it. The noise, the power. "Aim for the pine cone, the big one." She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The kick sent her staggering back, her shoulders screaming in protest. She had missed by a foot. "Again," he said. She did it again and again. She learned to breathe. She learned to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. On the 7th shot, the pine cone exploded in a puff of snow and bark. She turned to him, her face alive with a fierce, wild pride. He did not smile, but his eyes were warm. "Good. Now, the traps." He taught her to make a snare. He sat on a log, his good hand twisting the wire, showing her the loop. She sat beside him, her cold fingers clumsy, mimicking his movements. His hand would cover hers, guiding the wire, his calloused thumb brushing her skin. It was a touch more intimate than any kiss. In the evenings, they sat by the stove. The fire was their only light. The hunger was a constant, dull ache. To fight it, She read to him. She had saved one book, stuffed into her pocket the night of the fire, a small volume of poems. She read aloud, her voice filling the small, dark room. He listened, his head leaned back against the wall, his eyes closed. "Read that one again," he would say. He stumbled over the words, but he said them. He was seeing a world beyond shovels and graves. She was seeing a world beyond shame and rules. She learned the feel of a trigger, the cold logic of a snare. He learned the rhythm of a sonnet. They were becoming one person, a creature built of his resilience and her defiance. "We could go south," he said one night, staring into the red glow of the stove. "When the thaw comes." "South? Arizona or New Mexico. No one knows us there. It is new, a new place." The hope in his voice was a fragile thing. He was daring to dream. "I could teach," she said, the idea taking root. "In a new town, a new school." "And I could build," he said, flexing his good hand, "houses, not boxes." They held on to that. The dream of Arizona. A place where the sun was hot and the world was not gray. A place where their names were clean. But the wilderness was a hard master. The rabbit she snared was small. It lasted 2 days. The handful of flour she'd found was gone. The hunger returned. Sharper this time. "I have to go back," she said. Eli stood, his face grim. His hand was healing, but it was still a mess of raw, pink skin. He was weak. "No, I will not let you, and I will not let us starve." She was already pulling on her coat. She had money. The small amount she had brought from Boston, hidden in the lining of her valise. She had retrieved it from Mrs. Gable's. A silent, swift theft in the night before she fled. "Eleanor, they will be watching. Halford, he is not a man who forgives. He is not a man I am asking forgiveness from." She touched his face. "I will be careful. I will go to the general store. I will buy supplies, and I will be back before moonrise. I am the one who can do this." He looked at her, at the new strength in her face. He nodded. Once, the reversal was complete. He was the one who must wait. She was the one who must hunt. The walk to White Ridge was long. The snow was deep, but a path had been beaten down by wagons. The town, when she saw it, looked small and ugly, a black smudge on the white landscape. She kept her head down, her hat pulled low. She entered Henderson's general store. The few people inside turned. The whispers started instantly. Mr. Henderson, a small man with nervous eyes, looked at her. Miss Whitcomb, we thought you had left." "I need flour," she said, her voice clear and cold. "And bacon, salt, and laudanum." He flinched at the last word. For pain?" "For pain." She paid in coin. He bagged her supplies, his hands trembling. He would not meet her eyes. She took the heavy sack. She could feel the eyes on her back. She stepped outside, onto the boardwalk. And they were there. Reverend Halford, Mr. Plum, and 3 other men, their faces hard with self-righteousness. They were not carrying torches. They did not need to. Their eyes burned cold. "So," Reverend Halford said, his voice booming in the quiet street, "the harlot returns." Eleanor tried to step around them. Mr. Plum blocked her path. "We have a place for women like you, Miss Whitcomb. Let me pass." "She denies her sin!" a woman's voice shrieked. "Mrs." Plum stood on the porch of the store, her face a knot of fury. "Seize her," Halford commanded. The men grabbed her. She fought, kicking, but they were strong. She dropped the sack of flour. It burst on the boardwalk, a white explosion that coated their boots. "No!" she screamed. "The food, their survival." They did not care. They dragged her down the street. The town was watching. No one stepped in. Sheriff Brody was nowhere to be seen. They dragged her through the mud and snow. The force was so violent that one of her old boots was sucked from her foot. A man grabbed her other leg and yanked the second boot off, throwing it aside. "A harlot should be barefoot," Mrs. Plum sneered, following them. "Like Mary Magdalene, she will walk in the snow and feel the cold of her sin." They did not stop until they reached the church. They threw her through the side door, into the vestry. She landed hard on the cold stone floor. The door opened. Halford entered, flanked by Mr. and Mrs. Plum. They looked down on her. "You are a blight, Eleanor Whitcomb," Halford said, his voice low, filled with a terrible, calm fury. "You came to this town under false pretenses. You corrupted our children, and you laid with the beast. You are possessed by a demon of lust. He is a better man than you will ever be," she spat, pulling herself to a sitting position. "You see," Mrs. Plum whispered. "The demon speaks from her." "You have one chance," Halford said. "We will lock you in here. You will pray. You will fast. And when you are ready to publicly renounce that murderer, that thing, and beg forgiveness from God and this congregation, we will cleanse you. We will pray for your soul." Eleanor looked at their faces, the righteous glee, the hunger for her shame. She thought of Boston. She thought of her family's silent judgment. She thought of Eli, his hand held in the fire. She stood up. Her bare feet were already numb on the stone. "No." Halford's face darkened. "What did you say?" "I said, no, I will not beg. I will not renounce him. And I will not be cleansed by hypocrites and cowards. You are the sinners. You, with your Bibles and your torches. You are the ones who are possessed." Mrs. Plum gasped. Halford raised a hand as if to strike her, but stopped. "So be it," he said, his voice cold as the floor. "You will stay here. You will stay until you break, or until you freeze. God will have his justice." He turned. The others followed. The heavy oak door slammed shut. She heard the scrape of a key in the lock. She was alone, in the dark, barefoot. She looked around. The room was small, filled with dark robes and choir books. There was one window, a small, stained glass depiction of a lamb. She waited. She listened. She heard their voices fade. She was not the woman from Boston. She was not the quiet school teacher. She went to the small altar. She picked up the heavy brass candlestick. She wrapped her wool shawl around her hand. She did not hesitate. She swung the candlestick with all her strength. The sound of shattering glass was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of her own freedom. She knocked out the remaining shards. Cold, clean air poured in. She climbed onto the altar. The frame was high. She had to hoist herself up. The broken glass bit into her hands. She felt the sharp, hot sting as it cut her. She pushed her head and shoulders through. She felt the glass snag her dress, tearing at her skin. She did not care. She fell, dropping 4 feet into a deep snowdrift behind the church. She landed in the graveyard, Eli's yard. She stood, her feet, already numb, sank into the snow. She looked at her hands. They were bleeding. She did not feel the cold. She did not feel the pain. She began to run, barefoot, bleeding. She ran through the graves, past the burned-out shell of the shack. She ran into the dark forest, following the path only she knew, back to the cabin, back to him. The forest was a gray, silent hell. The snow was not soft. It was a cold, granular trap. It packed into the open cuts on her feet, a pain so sharp it was almost hot. Then a numbness so deep it was terrifying. Eleanor did not feel it. She felt nothing but the rhythmic, desperate pull of her lungs and the single, burning image in her mind. The cabin. She was no longer running from White Ridge. She was running to Eli. Her hands, cut and bleeding from the window, left small, dark drops on the white snow. She stumbled, her torn dress snagging on a branch, ripping open to her knee. The cold air hit her skin like a slap. She was an animal, all instinct, all forward motion. The quiet, bookish Miss Whitcomb was a ghost, left behind in the ashes of the church. She did not know how long she ran. An hour, a lifetime. She burst through the last line of trees. There it was, the cabin, a dark shape against the snow, a thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. He was there. He was alive. He was waiting. The relief was a physical blow. It hit her harder than the cold. Her legs, which had carried her for miles, turned to water. She took one more step, her hand outstretched, and the world dissolved into a black, rushing void. She collapsed into the snowdrift, not 10 yards from the door. He was on her in a second. Eli had not been sleeping. He had been standing by the door, rifle in hand, listening. He had heard the snap of the first twig. He burst from the cabin, expecting Halford, expecting the posse. He saw her, a bundle of dark, torn rags in the snow. "Eleanor!" His voice was a raw, broken sound. He scooped her up. She was frighteningly light, her body already going stiff. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the world. He laid her on the cot, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unbutton his own coat. He wrapped her in it. He piled their 2 thin blankets on top. She was shivering, a deep, rattling tremor that seemed to be shaking her apart. "No, no, no," he whispered, his voice frantic. He stoked the fire, throwing on the last of their wood, desperate for heat. He lit the lantern, and he saw her. Her hair was matted with snow and dried blood. Her face was chalk white. He looked at her hands, still clenched. He gently uncurled her fingers. They were slashed, the blood frozen in dark, crystalline tracks. He looked at her feet. The sight made him stop breathing. They were blue, raw, and lacerated. The snow had packed into the wounds. "What did they do?" he breathed. "What did they do to you?" He grabbed the canteen and a rag, his movements rough, terrified. He began to clean her feet. She cried out in her sleep, a thin, wounded sound. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am sorry. It is my fault, all of it. I am sorry. Eleanor." He cleaned the cuts, his rough hands impossibly gentle. He found the laudanum she had dropped in the cabin, and he put a few drops in a cup of water, lifting her head to make her drink. He tore the last of his clean shirt into strips and bandaged her hands and feet, swaddling them in rags. She was still shivering. The fire was not enough. He lay down on the narrow cot behind her, pulling her back against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, sharing his own body heat, his chin resting on the top of her head. He held her all night, his body rigid, his eyes wide open, staring into the dark. He rocked her, as one would a terrified child. He whispered apologies. He whispered promises he knew he might not be able to keep. "I will get you out of here," he murmured against her hair. "I promise. We will go south. We will see the sun. I will not let them touch you again. I will not. I will kill them first." He felt the moment her shivering began to subside, the moment her breathing deepened, as she fell from the cold into a true, exhausted sleep. He did not sleep. He held her, listening to the wind, and he let himself, for the first time, feel the full, crushing weight of his rage. Dawn came, pale and gray. Eleanor woke to the smell of wood smoke and the solid, steady beat of his heart against her back. She was warm. She was safe. She turned in his arms. His eyes were open, red-rimmed, staring. He looked 100 years old. "Eli?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He just held her tighter, burying his face in her hair. "You are alive." "I ran," she said, the memory flooding back. "The church, they locked me in. I broke the window." He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. They will come," as if the words had summoned them. A shout echoed through the trees. "Foster!" We know you are in there! Eli was off the cot in an instant. He grabbed the rifle. He moved to the small, cracked window. Outside, in the snow, was the posse. Halford was at the front, his face purple with cold and fury. Mr. Plum was beside him, holding a shotgun. There were 5 others, all armed, and at the back, on his horse, was Sheriff Brody. "Come out, demon lover," Halford bellowed. "Give us the woman. We will cleanse her, and you will face God's judgment." "Stay away from the window," Eli said to Eleanor, his voice a low, lethal growl she had never heard. He checked the load in the rifle. "Eli, no," she pleaded, pulling herself up. Her feet screamed in protest. "They are not taking you." He stepped to the door. "Then they will not take me," she said. She grabbed his arm. "We go out together." He looked at her, at the iron in her eyes. He nodded. He unbarred the door and opened it. He stepped out onto the small, snow-covered porch. Eleanor was right behind him, her hand on his back. She was barefoot, wrapped in his coat, her head high. The posse stopped. Their breath plumed in the air. "There," Halford pointed. "You see? He has her. She is his captive." "I am no one's captive, Reverend," Eleanor called out, her voice clear and strong. It carried in the cold, still air. "I am here by my own choice." The men shifted, their certainty wavering. Sheriff Brody nudged his horse forward, his eyes on Eleanor. He saw her bandaged hands. He saw her bare, bandaged feet. His expression, usually impassive, darkened. "Give her to us! Foster!" Plum shouted, raising his shotgun. "Or we will burn this shack down with you in it." Eli raised his rifle. He did not aim at Plum. He aimed at the snow at his feet. He fired. The shot was deafening. It echoed off the ridge like a cannon. Snow kicked up, making Plum jump back. "The next one is not the snow," Eli said, his voice flat. He levered another round into the chamber. He stepped in front of Eleanor, shielding her with his body. "Murder!" Halford shrieked. "He will murder us all." "That is enough." Sheriff Brody's voice cut through the air. He rode his horse between the posse and the cabin. He turned to face Halford. "Reverend," Brody said, his voice quiet, but carrying. "You and your men will lower your weapons." "We are doing the Lord's work, Sheriff." "You are a mob," Brody said, "and you are done." He turned his gaze to Eli. "Foster, put the rifle down." Eli stared at him, his gaze hard. "Not while they are armed." Brody nodded. He looked back at Halford. "Reverend, I am the law in this county. Not you. I am asking you one time. What crime have these 2 committed?" Halford's face was incredulous. "Crime. They have lived in open, unholy sin. This woman, this Jezebel, she has abandoned her post. She has corrupted this man. He is a convicted felon. They are a blight." "Is that so?" Brody said, his voice dangerously soft. "I see 2 people in a cabin. I see a woman who looks like she has been dragged through hell. I see a man protecting his home." He leaned down from his saddle. "You talk of sin, Reverend, but I have a sworn statement from Mr. Henderson that you and your men cornered this woman. I have a report that she was dragged, screaming, to your church. I have a witness who says you locked her in. That, Reverend, is called kidnapping. That is a crime." Halford's mouth opened and closed. "And you, Plum," the sheriff continued. "I have been wondering who burned down Mr. Foster's shack a few nights back. Arson, also a crime." The posse began to back away, their righteous anger dissolving into fear. "Now," Brody said, "I am giving you all a choice. You can disperse, go home, and pray to whatever God you think you know that I do not decide to pursue this. Or you can stay, and I will arrest every last one of you for disturbing the peace. Kidnapping and conspiracy to commit violence. What is it to be?" Halford looked at the faces of his men. Their certainty was gone. They were just cold, armed men, suddenly on the wrong side of the law. He looked at Eleanor, at her unbreakable stare. He looked at Eli, his fingers still on the trigger. He lowered his hand. This town is damned. This town is tired. Reverend, Brody said, go home. The posse dissolved. They turned, one by one, and trudged back through the snow, their weapons pointed at the ground. Halford was the last to go. He gave Eleanor one last look, a look of pure, undiluted hatred. Then he, too, turned and followed his broken flock. Only Sheriff Brody remained. Eli slowly, carefully, lowered the rifle. Sheriff, he said. Brody nodded at him. He looked at Eleanor. Ma'am, you are safe, but you cannot stay here. They are beaten, but they are not changed. We are leaving, Eleanor said. We are heading south. Good. Brody reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy canvas sack. He tossed it to the porch. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. That is the food you paid for, mister. Henderson was eager to make amends. He pulled something else from his pocket, a pair of thick woolen socks and a pair of worn men's boots. They are not fancy, but they will get you to the flatlands. Eleanor could not speak. Thank you, Sheriff, Eli said. I am not a churchgoer, Brody said, gathering his reins. But I know a hypocrite when I see one. I have seen too many men in my time with Bibles and torches, claiming to do God's work. All they ever do is make orphans. He tipped his hat. Good luck to you, ma'am. Mr. Foster. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving them alone in the white, silent woods. They did not speak. Eli went inside and began to pack their few things. The rifle, a knife, the blanket. Eleanor sat on the cot. She pulled on the thick wool socks. She slid her bandaged feet into the boots. They were too big, but they were warm. They were safety. They had to go back, one last time. The walk to White Ridge was a funeral procession. They walked down the center of the main street. The town's fever had broken. The moral righteousness was gone, replaced by a hollow, weary shame. People watched from their windows. Those on the street looked away. They saw Eleanor, her head high, wearing a man's boots. They saw Eli, his rifle held in his good hand, his burned hand tucked into his coat. A woman, Mrs. Davies, whose daughter had been in Eleanor's class, stepped out of the seamstress shop. Miss Whitcomb? She whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. I am sorry. Eleanor paused. She looked at the woman's fearful, ashamed face. She nodded once, and she kept walking. They parted at the center of town. Eli nodded toward the graveyard. I have one thing to do. The schoolhouse, Eleanor said. She walked to the small, cold building. The door was unlocked. She stepped inside. The air was cold, smelling of chalk and mice. Miss Whitcomb. 3 of her remaining students, who had been playing in the street, ran in. It was Thomas, and the 2 youngest. They did not care about the gossip. They did not care about the sin. They just saw their teacher. They ran to her, hugging her legs, their small faces streaked with tears. You came back, Thomas cried. Are you staying? Eleanor knelt. The pain in her feet was a distant ache. She hugged them, all 3 at once, burying her face in their wood smoke-scented hair. This was the first thing that had truly broken her. No, Thomas, she whispered, her voice thick. I cannot stay. She stood. She walked to her desk. Her lesson plans for the week were still there, lying open. Arithmetic, Chapter 4, The History of the Republic. She closed the book. She left the lesson plans on the desk, a silent offering to a life that was now over. She walked out the door, not looking back. Eli walked through the low stone wall of the chapel yard. The smoke smell still hung in the air from his shack. The new grave he had been digging was still open, half filled with snow. He ignored it. He walked to the back of the yard, to the small, unmarked wooden cross. Sarah's grave. He knelt. From his coat, he pulled a small, rough cluster of pine boughs and winter blue berries he had gathered on the walk down. It was all the forest offered. He laid it at the base of the cross. He stayed there for a long time, his hand resting on the frozen wood. He thought of the girl who had been so terrified. He thought of the 4 years he had spent in a stone cell, paying for her fear. He had carried that hatred, that loneliness, for a decade. He looked up, toward the town, toward the schoolhouse where he knew Eleanor was. He turned back to the grave. "You were not alone," he whispered to the cold earth. "I was not either." He stood. He turned his back on the grave. He walked out of the chapel yard for the last time. Eleanor was waiting at the edge of town, where the main street turned into a wagon track heading south. She was holding the sack of supplies. He came and stood beside her. They looked back at White Ridge, the broken buildings, the false fronts, the tall, judgmental steeple of the church. He held out his good hand. She took it. They turned south and began to walk. They did not look back. White Ridge fell away behind them, a bad memory swallowed by the snow. They walked for 2 days before they caught a ride on a freight wagon heading south, huddled in the back among sacks of grain, their silence a shared blanket. The driver, a man with a face like cured leather, asked no questions. He just accepted the coin Eli gave him and pointed his mules toward the pass. The world changed. The snow thinned, then vanished, replaced by a high, cold desert of red rock and juniper. The sky was immense, a deep, aching blue that seemed to hold no judgment. They left Colorado. They entered the territory of New Mexico. They were ghosts, possessing nothing but a rifle, a sack of food, and the clothes on their backs. They were also, for the first time, free. They moved from one hardscrabble job to the next. They were 2 more drifters in a land full of them, on a sprawling cattle ranch near the Cimarron. Eli worked the branding fires, his good hand quick with a rope, his burned hand, now healing into a tight, pink scar, kept gloved. He was quiet. He was strong, and the foreman did not care about his past. Eleanor, her feet slowly mending inside the sheriff's boots, worked in the cookhouse, peeling potatoes and washing clothes in a cloud of lye soap and steam. Her hands, cut and scarred from the window, grew rougher, stronger. They saved their pay, a few dollars here, a few there. They moved on. In a small, dusty outpost, Eli dug wells. He was good with the earth. He understood it. He would work all day in the sun, his body slick with sweat and mud. And Eleanor would read to the grubby, illiterate children of the other laborers, sitting on a flat rock under the thin shade of a mesquite tree. They learned each other's rhythms. They learned the silence of work, the comfort of exhaustion. They slept in barns, in lean-tos, under the stars. They no longer spoke of White Ridge. They did not speak of the fire, or the church, or the blood. They spoke of water. They spoke of the next job. They spoke of the line on the horizon. After 3 months of drifting, they found it. It was not a town. Not really. It was a valley, a crease in the dry hills on the border of New Mexico. It was called, by the few who lived there, La Angostura, the Narrows. It was poor. A scattering of adobe houses, a half-fallen mission church, and a single, sad-looking cantina. The people here were a mix of prospectors who had given up, Mexican families who had always been there, and white settlers who were too broke or too stubborn to move on. No one here cared about Boston scandals or Kansas lies. They cared about the drought. They cared about the next meal. It felt like home. They found a small, abandoned adobe hut at the edge of the valley. Its roof was half gone, the windows empty holes. "We can fix it," Eli said. He stood in the doorway, looking at the hard-packed dirt floor. "Yes," Eleanor said, touching the sun-baked mud wall. "We can—" They worked. Eli, with his builder's hands, cut new vigas from the pines up on the ridge. He learned to make adobe bricks, mixing the mud and straw, letting them bake in the relentless sun. Eleanor, using her small savings, bought glass for the windows. She whitewashed the inside walls, the lime bright and clean. It became a home, a small, solid thing they had built with their own hands. Life settled. It was a hard life, but it was theirs. Eleanor, seeing the children running wild, the ones who spoke a mix of English and Spanish, felt the old pull. She did not ask permission from any board. She did not seek out a reverend. She walked to the largest barn, owned by a sheep farmer named Montoya, and she asked if she could use it. He shrugged. "For what, señorita?" "For learning." She started with 3 students. Within a week, she had 10. She taught them in the barn, the air sweet with hay and sheep. She had no slate. She used chalk on a wide, smooth plank of wood. She had no books, so she told them stories. She taught them sums by counting goats. She taught them letters by writing their names in the dirt. She was not Miss Whitcomb, the disgraced teacher. She was maestra. Eli found his own trade. People died in La Angostura, just as they did everywhere, and they needed boxes. He was still a man of the earth, a man who understood last things. He began building coffins. He did not ask for money. He bartered. A simple, sturdy pine box for a sack of flour. A small, child-sized casket for a bolt of blue fabric. A well-made coffin for a dozen eggs and a side of cured bacon. He worked outside their small house, under a cottonwood tree. The sound of his hammer and saw was steady, a rhythm of life. Not death. It was the sound of provision. Their love, which had been a desperate, fiery thing born in a storm, changed. It settled. It grew steadier, like the wide, slow river that cut through the valley. It was less about the frantic need not to be alone, and more about the quiet, solid fact that they were together. It was grounding. But the past was not a ghost. It was a passenger. They still carried their trauma. Eleanor, some nights, would wake up, her heart pounding, the smell of smoke in her nose, her hands clenched as if gripping broken glass. She would sit up, gasping, her eyes wide and terrified in the dark. Eli would wake instantly. He would not offer empty comfort. He would not say, "It was just a dream." He would sit up, light the candle, and hand her the canteen. "You are here," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "You are in the valley. You are safe. I am here." He had his own nightmares. He would dream of Kansas, of a cell door clanging shut, of a woman's face, pale with laudanum, under a wooden cross. He would wake with a start, his good hand clenched, his burned hand aching as if it were in the fire again. Eleanor would slide her hand into his. She would not speak. She would just hold his hand, her scarred fingers lacing with his, until his breathing slowed, until the past released its grip. Their desire for each other had not faded. If anything, it was deeper. But it was no longer the desperate, breathless collision in the shadows. It was no longer just passion. It was possession. In the truest sense, it was a fierce, profound protectiveness. When he came in from work, his face streaked with dust, he would wash at the basin. She would come and stand behind him, pressing her face against his back, wrapping her arms around his waist. He would lean his head back, his wet hair brushing her cheek. It was a silent conversation. "You are mine. You are safe." When she was teaching, he would sometimes walk to the barn and stand in the shadows. Just watching, he would watch her, her face animated, her hands dusty with chalk, and a look would come over his face, a look of such raw, protective tenderness that it was almost painful. They were building a life. It was fragile, but it was real. They had been in the valley for 6 months. The heat of summer was beginning to settle. The river was low. Eleanor was walking back from the barn, a small woven basket of eggs in her hand, a payment from one of the families. A horse was tied to the rail outside the cantina. It was a good horse, too good for La Angostura. It was tall, a dark bay, and its tack was clean. It wore a brand she did not recognize. She felt a prickle, a cold, familiar chill, out of place in the afternoon heat. She quickened her step. When she reached their house, Eli was standing outside, by the cottonwood tree. He was not working. He was just standing, his hands at his sides, staring at a man. The man was tall, dressed in a black, dusty suit. He had a hard, narrow face and eyes as cold and gray as a White Ridge winter. "Not your concern, Foster," the man was saying. His voice was oily. "I am here for the woman." "She is not here," Eli said, his voice dangerously flat. "She is. We know. You have been sloppy. A letter written for one of these locals to her family back east, begging for money. No doubt, the postmaster in Santa Fe recognized the name. He is a good, God-fearing man." The man smiled. "Reverend Halford has a long reach." Eleanor's blood went cold. She had written one letter, months ago, a short, desperate note to her sister, just to say she was alive. "Eleanor," Eli said, sensing her. He did not turn. She stepped forward, the basket of eggs heavy in her hand. The man's eyes slid to her. He looked her up and down, taking in her simple cotton skirt, her sun-browned skin, her scarred hands. His lip curled. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "you have caused a great deal of trouble, but the Reverend is a forgiving man. He has sent me to retrieve you." "Retrieve me?" Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "You are to return to White Ridge. You are to stand moral trial before the church. You will be cleansed of your sin. It is the only way to save your soul." "I am not going anywhere," Eleanor said. The man sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "You misunderstand. This is not a request." He looked at Eli. "Get out of the way. Foster, this is church business." "You are not touching her," Eli said. The man's smile widened. It was a terrible sight. "Still playing the guard dog? I see." He took a step closer. "Or is it that you just like her? Is that it? After all, you have a taste for other men's women, for used things." Eli moved so fast, Eleanor barely saw it. He crossed the space in one step, his good hand clenched. But the man was ready. He was younger, faster than Eli expected. He sidestepped the blow and drove a fist into Eli's stomach. Eli grunted, doubling over. "She is a harlot, Foster," the man spat, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "And you are the whore's dog." That was the mistake. Eli came up, not with a fist, but with a roar. It was not the sound of a man. It was the sound of something caged for too long. He did not just hit the man. He tackled him, driving him to the ground. The basket of eggs shattered. Eli was on top of him, his good hand a piston. He struck the man's face, once, twice. There was the wet, cracking sound of bone. "Eli!" Eleanor screamed. Eli did not hear her. He was not in the valley. He was in Kansas. He was in White Ridge. His burned hand gripped the man's throat, the scarred tissue pulling, but holding. His right hand rose and fell. "Eli, stop! You are killing him!" The man under him had stopped struggling. He was limp, his face a bloody mask. Eleanor grabbed Eli's arm, her nails digging in. "Eli, please!" He froze, his fist raised. He stared down at the broken man. His breathing was a ragged, tearing sound, slowly, as if waking from a dream. He looked at his hand, covered in blood. He looked at Eleanor. The rage drained away, leaving a hollow, terrible shame. He rolled off the man and staggered back, his body trembling. The man on the ground groaned, He was not dead. He spat a tooth into the dust. He slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his hands and knees. You will pay for this. Foster! He wheezed, blood dripping from his mouth. This is not over. The Reverend, he will not be defied. More will come. We will see her burn. He crawled to his horse, pulled himself into the saddle, and rode away. A broken, bleeding silhouette against the setting sun. The silence that fell was worse than the violence. Eli stood, his hands shaking, staring at the blood in the dust. Eli, Eleanor whispered. He would not look at her. He turned and walked away, past the house, walking fast toward the river. She found him an hour later. He was sitting on the bank, scrubbing his hands in the muddy water, scrubbing them raw. She sat beside him. The sun was gone. The world was purple. They will never stop, she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of grief. She began to weep. It was not the silent, dignified weeping of her past. It was a raw, broken sobbing. All the fear she had held back in White Ridge, on the road, even here, it all came pouring out. He was right, she cried, her voice muffled in her hands. I am marked. I am poison. I have brought this to you. Your shack, your hand, and now this. They will never let me rest. He stopped scrubbing. He sat for a long time, his hands dripping. Then he reached out, not with his clean hand, but with his burned one. He touched her hair. We are not who we were. Eleanor, he said, his voice quiet, but fierce. She looked up, her face streaked with tears and dust. That woman, the one who was left alone in Boston, she is gone. That man, the one who sat in a cell in Kansas, he is gone, too. He cupped her face, his scarred hand rough against her skin. They burned us. They tried to bury us, but we did not stay in the ground. We are who we chose. He pulled her to him. They can send 100 men. They will not take you from me. This is our home. She looked at him, at the absolute conviction in his eyes. Her sobs quieted. The fear did not vanish, but it receded, beaten back by the solid, unshakable truth of him. That night, they did not sleep in the house. They took a blanket and walked up to the high ridge above the valley, where the wind blew clean. They built a small fire. They sat, watching the stars, a million cold, bright judgments that, for the first time, felt like allies. I will not be his whore, she whispered. I will not be your sin. I want to be your wife. Eli looked at her. He had nothing. No ring, no money, no name to give her that was not already ruined. I have nothing to offer you, he said, his voice rough. You have your hands, she said, taking them, the scarred one and the clean one. You have your promise. That is all I have ever wanted. He had one thing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, bent silver coin. A dime. He had carried it since Kansas. It was his only luck. He held it up in the firelight. It is not a ring. It is better, she said. There was no preacher. There was no church. There was just them, and the wind in the pines, and the light of a single candle they had brought. He took her hands. Before whatever God is out here, he said, his voice thick. I, Eli Foster, I take you, Eleanor Whitcomb, to be my wife, to hold, to protect, from this day, until the end. She was weeping again, but not from fear. And I, Eleanor Whitcomb, she answered, her voice shaking, take you, Eli Foster, to be my husband, to stand with, to love, from this day, until the very end. He pressed the silver dime into her palm and closed her fingers over it. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of sealing, a vow. They were married, just them and the candle and the sound of the wind. They were Mr. and Mrs. foster, and they were ready for whatever came next. The months in La Angostura passed, marked by the sun and the small, steady rhythms of their new life. The sharp, metallic taste of fear began to fade, replaced by the dusty, mundane taste of hard work. Their marriage, sealed by a candle and the wind, was a quiet, solid thing. It existed not in declarations, but in the way he would bring her a cup of water before she asked, and the way she would mend his shirt, her scarred fingers patient with the needle. Then, in the deep heat of late summer, Eleanor knew. She had missed her time. At first, she dismissed it, the stress, the heat. But then came the familiar, hollow ache in the morning, the weariness in her bones. She was pregnant. The news, which should have been a simple joy, was a cold stone of terror. Her hand went to her flat stomach, and the memory, the one she buried every single day, rose up. Boston, the rain on the window, the cold, empty room, the blood, the feeling of her life draining away. Alone. She hid it for a week. She hid the fear behind a mask of hope. She would go about her day, teaching the children their letters, her mind a frantic prayer. "Not again, please, not again." She finally told him one evening, as they sat outside, watching the sky turn a deep, bruised purple. "Eli," she said, her voice so small he almost did not hear it. I am with child." He went perfectly still. He had been cleaning his rifle, his hands steady. Now, they were frozen. He slowly set the rifle down. He did not speak. He just looked at her, his eyes searching her face in the twilight. "Are you, is it?" He could not form the question. "Are you well?" "I am well," she said, forcing a smile. It is a good thing. Eli, a new life." He reached out, his hand trembling, and laid it on her stomach. His touch was so gentle, it was barely there. He was quiet for a long time. Then, she saw the glint of tears in his eyes. He was not smiling, but a profound, quiet joy radiated from him. "A new life," he whispered, as if the words were a prayer he had not dared to speak. His joy, however, was tinged with a deep, suffocating fear. He became her shadow. He was no longer just her protector. He was her keeper. He watched every move she made. He would not let her carry the water from the well. He brought her cushions to sit on in the barn. He would wake in the night, not from his own nightmares, but just to listen to her breathe. He was a man who had seen the world snatch away everything he had ever cared for. And he was waiting for the tragedy. He was waiting for the other boot to drop. His fear fed her own. She wanted to be hopeful. She wanted to believe this time was different. But every twinge, every ache, sent a jolt of pure panic through her. She was terrified to be alone, terrified of the memory of blood. The man from White Ridge never returned. No others came. The valley remained quiet. The news came in the fall, carried by a freight driver passing through on his way to Santa Fe. He sat at the cantina, and Eli was there, trading a small, well-made coffin for a sack of beans. "Heard some strange news from up north," the driver said, sipping his whiskey. "From that mining town, White Ridge." Eli froze. "What news?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The whole place is coming apart. They say, but the big news, the preacher, Halford, he is dead." Eli's hand tightened on the sack of beans. "How?" The driver shrugged. "Fire, a big one. Started in the chapel, middle of the night. Went up like a tinderbox. They say the preacher was inside, trapped. They found what was left of him in the morning. Some say it was a judgment, that the man was well, that he was more fire and brimstone than God." "And the fire?" Eli asked. "How did it start?" "Nobody knows. The steeple was struck by lightning 2 weeks before. They say maybe it was a slow burn. Maybe it was something else." The driver lowered his voice. "That town had had a sickness. A lot of folks hated that preacher. Some say he got what he was owed." Eli paid for the beans and left. He walked home, the news a heavy, silent weight in his chest. He found Eleanor sorting dried herbs. "Alfred is dead," he said, his voice flat. She looked up, her eyes wide. "The chapel, it burned down. He was inside." Eleanor sat down slowly on the stool. She did not feel joy. She did not feel relief. She felt a great, hollowing emptiness, the force that had hunted them, the source of their shame and their flight, was gone. It was just over. The fire, its cause unknown, felt like the closing of a dark, terrible book. The shadow was lifted. They did not speak of it again that day. But that night, as they lay in the dark, Eleanor turned to him. "The cabin?" she whispered. He knew, instantly, what she meant. The miners' cabin, the place they had hidden, the place they had become them. "It is empty," he said. "It is ours," she answered. La Angostura was a safe harbor, but it was not home. It was a place to hide. Now, they did not have to hide. "He is gone," Eli said, more to himself than to her. "The thread is gone." "I want to go back," she said. "Not to the town, never to the town, but to the woods. I want our child to be born there, in the place we were saved." He thought of the clean, cold air, of the pines, of the isolation that was not loneliness, but safety. "We will leave in the morning," he said. They sold their small house for a pittance, a few dollars and a sturdy wagon. They bartered Eli's tools for supplies: flour, salt, bacon, and a heavy axe. They said their goodbyes to Mr. Montoya and to the children in the barn. They traveled north. It was not the desperate, frantic flight of a year ago. They were not two broken people running for their lives. They were a family. Eleanor sat on the wagon seat, her belly round under her shawl. Eli sat beside her, the rifle resting across his knees, his gaze on the horizon. They gave White Ridge a wide, hateful berth. They saw the black smudge of its smoke from 10 miles away and turned, heading deep into the foothills, following the old game trails Eli knew by heart. After 3 days, they found it. The cabin was still standing, just as they had left it. It was buried in a new drift of early snow, the roof sagging, the door hanging open on one hinge. It was a ruin. It was perfect. "It is worse than I remember," Eleanor said, her hand on her back. "It is strong," Eli said. "The bones are good." He set to work. This was not a desperate repair. It was a reclaiming. He was a builder. He was building a home. He spent days on the roof, replacing the rotted pine shakes, his hammer a steady, echoing beat in the silent forest. He cut and split firewood, his good hand and his scarred hand working together. The scar, once a mark of his torture, was now just a part of him, a reminder of what he had survived. The woodpile grew into a fortress against the coming cold. Eleanor, heavy with the child, did what she could. She could not scrub or lift, but she could mend. She found the old, dirty rags she had used to bandage his feet. She washed them in the creek until they were clean. She tore them into strips and braided them into a small, bright rug. She had Eli bring her buckets of lime and water. She painted the interior walls. The cabin had been dark, smelling of soot and fear. She covered the old scars. She painted over the memories. The walls became a bright, clean white. The sunlight, reflecting off the snow outside, filled the small room, making it feel large, making it feel new. She used the fabric Eli had earned in the valley to make curtains, a bright, startling blue against the white walls. They worked every day, from sunrise to sunset. They were not just rebuilding a shack. They were rebuilding their lives. They were proving to the ghosts, and to themselves, that they had the right to be there. Winter settled in, deep and absolute. The snow piled to the eaves. The world shrank once more to the 4 walls of the cabin. But this time, it was not a prison. It was a fortress. It was a nest. They had food. They had fire. They had each other. Eli was terrified. As Eleanor's time drew closer, his old, stoic calm shattered. He would sit for hours, just watching her, his face taut with a fear she understood. He was remembering her first loss. He was bracing for the tragedy. "It will be different this time, Eli," she would tell him, taking his hand. "I am not alone." But he would just nod, his eyes still dark with dread. He channeled his fear into his hands. He had found a perfect, straight-grained piece of pine. Every night, by the light of the fire, he worked on it. He was not a carver of decorations. He was a builder. He was making a crib. He cut the posts. He sanded the rails until they were smooth as water. He fitted the joints with a precision that was a form underscore of prayer. He was building something to hold their hope. He was building a defense against the world. Eleanor would sit, her hands busy knitting small clothes from yarn, and listen to the shh of his plane, the soft tap of his mallet. The sound was a lullaby. It was the sound of a father preparing for his child. The spring came late, with a slow, agonizing melt. The world dripped, the creek swelled, and Eleanor's time came. It began one night with a low, persistent ache. Eli, who had been sleeping in his clothes for a month, was instantly awake. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that broke her heart. "It is all right," she breathed, gripping his hand. "It is just time." It was not all right. It was long. It was hard. The cabin that had been their sanctuary became a room of pain. Eleanor's fear, the one she had hidden for so long, came roaring to the surface. She clung to Eli's hand, the memory of that cold Boston room threatening to drown her. "I cannot," she wept, as the pain crested. "Eli, I am afraid." "You are not alone," he said, his voice a raw, desperate anchor. He wiped her face with a cool cloth. "You are not alone, Eleanor. I am here. You are strong. We are strong. Hold on to me." He was her rock. He held her. He breathed with her. He did not flinch from her pain. He met her fear with his own steady presence. He was the man who had survived prison. He was the man who had survived fire. He would survive this. After a night and a day, when Eleanor thought she had nothing left, when the world had been reduced to a single, blinding point of agony, it was over. A thin, startling wail cut through the silence. It was the cry of a new life. Eli, his face streaked with tears and sweat, let out a sound, a sob of such profound relief that it shook his entire body. He took the child, wrapped in a clean cloth, and laid her on Eleanor's chest. "A girl," he whispered, his voice broken. "Eleanor, a daughter." Eleanor wept, her tears not of pain, but of a release so deep it felt as if her soul was unclenching. She was here. The baby was here. They were alive. She looked at the small, perfect, red-faced creature. She thought of the shame, the fire, the fear, and she thought of the unearned, impossible blessing of this moment. "Her name," Eleanor whispered, her voice raw, "is Grace." Eli touched the baby's cheek with one rough finger. His hand, the burned one, was shaking. He, who had dug so many graves, had brought a life into the world. The cycle was broken. The penance was paid. The cabin was filled with a new kind of peace, the sound of a baby breathing, the sight of Eli, sitting by the fire, holding his daughter, his large, calloused hands impossibly gentle. He had finished the crib. It was simple, strong, and perfect. He had carved 2 small words on the headboard. We stayed. Weeks passed. The spring was warm. Grace grew, her cries replaced by small, content sounds. The forest, which had been their refuge, was now their home. One afternoon, when the sun was warm and the air smelled of pine and damp earth, Eli looked at Eleanor. "Come," he said. "There is something I want to show you." She bundled Grace in a blanket. Eli took her hand. They walked out of the cabin, past the woodpile, and through the trees. They walked to the edge of the forest, where the trees gave way to the low, stone wall of the White Ridge Chapel graveyard. The chapel itself was gone. Only a black, skeletal foundation remained. The gravestones were choked with new weeds. The place looked forgotten, cursed. Eleanor held Grace tighter. "Eli, I do not—" "We are not going in," he said. He led her along the edge of the wall, to a spot that overlooked the forest, their cabin a small, reassuring plume of smoke in the distance. He had been working here. There was a new stone. It was not a gravestone. It was a marker. A flat piece of granite he must have dragged from the creek bed. He had worked it. It was not polished, but the face was smooth. He had carved letters into it. His carving was like his building, simple, deep, and strong. It was not elegant. It was meant to last. Eleanor read the words aloud, her voice soft. "For all the things that tried to bury us." She looked at the second line. "We lived, we loved, we stayed." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Eli put his arm around her waist, pulling her and the baby close. He was no longer the gravedigger, the outcast. She was no longer the fallen woman, the exile. They stood there for a long time, the three of them, a family. They looked at the words Eli had carved, a final testament. Then they turned their backs on the graveyard, on the ashes of White Ridge, and walked home. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from, so please comment below and connect with others. Do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.